the Trump administration's taking into Washington, D.C. Obviously, we've heard about the National Guard and the policing, but also even before today's press conference, talking about, I don't want to call it a sweep, but saying, they got to go somewhere else, individuals that are unhoused. Your perspective on that rhetoric, that approach to this at the end of the day for a place like D.C. And then, of course, he's proposed potentially doing this in New York City, too.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we think that this is just political theater. It is blatantly unconstitutional and illegal, but it's also very dangerous because it's whipping up animosity against people who generally, unhoused folks through no fault of their own are finding themselves in economic circumstances that they can't get out of. I mean, looking at DC, certainly the reporting is that, all of the crime indicia are down, that homeless folks are not, in fact, tied to any of the source of criminal activity. One of the precipitating acts apparently is a bunch of young people who got into some sort of interaction with a Doge person. They're not homeless people. It's, really using and taking the opportunity to effectuate Project 2025, which calls for eliminating unhoused people, people with mental illness from the public domain, subjecting people who may have a mental illness or substance issue to involuntary treatment, and basically just getting them off the streets and out of public sector. Using the military as law enforcement should never be used against people who are unhoused. They should never be used against people with a mental illness or substance issue, people with disabilities. You want a health response that is informed by science, clinical responses. I mean, this is just really incredibly, incredibly offensive when you sit there and you understand that when you improve a person's access to housing, whether it's low barrier, no barrier, supportive in some way, affordable healthcare, economic opportunities, that's how you address both the homelessness issue and also treatment issues for people who require some sort of services. What we're seeing from the federal government is the criminalization of a person's disability or economic status at the same time that the federal government is eliminating almost entirely all of its funding supports for social services, for housing. In New York City, for example, they're just reporting that the city has made a choice to continue some of the COVID funding for housing vouchers, but that means they won't fund Section 8 vouchers. Every day in New York City, people become homeless. It's one paycheck away from homelessness. Families, elderly people, veterans, people with disabilities. So the feds are reducing, if not outright eliminating, supports for services that we know demonstrably address homelessness, address mental illness, and trying to sweep everybody away. It is just a recipe for disaster.
You mentioned the legality aspect of this earlier, and I know that I heard some people today brought up a few parts of the Constitution when it comes to this, a few different amendments at that. Where does that apply to you in this case?
So, what's going on in DC obviously is different. They have a different structure with home rule and, the power of both Congress as well as the president to direct what is going on down there. New York State, obviously has freestanding existence. It is a state. There are any number of constitutional protections here against the state coming in and taking action of this sort. The National Guard deployment we're seeing is being challenged in California currently. Very extensive complaint that's going to trial, I think, in about 3 days when the feds were deploying National Guard to engage in immigration activities. It would be the same sort of challenge here in New York State with respect to overreach by the federal government, federalization of the local police forces. That is just unacceptable. It is un-American. In DC, there's a claim that there's a state of emergency. This is a president and administration that continuously asserts an emergency need to respond. So we had an invasion at the border. We have transgendered people living in the world. Now we've got homeless people, people with mental illness. With every assertion of an emergency event, there's targeting at a vulnerable population. And, doesn't mean it won't happen here in New York. I would hope that, I've seen reporting, for example, that Eric Adams has said the NYPD, which is larger than most countries' standing armies, is doing a fine job. We can agree or disagree on that. But the fact of the matter is, in New York City, in New York State, we do not have, crime, rampant mayhem in the streets as the Trump administration suggests we do.
Just to get a touch deeper on that, the emergency
Mhm.
order declaration aspect of things, could that stretch as far as New York, or would there still be those barriers, or could there be an executive order hypothetically that overrides that?
Yeah, I mean, Trump has already threatened to do that. So, he can do sort of whatever he wants. And the question is, what is the pushback? What is the opposition? I assume that everyone has taken a look at what is going on in California. Don't know for a fact, but certainly the New York State Attorney General works in concert with the California Attorney General and a number of other states' Attorney General. I would assume they've looked at this particular play that's being executed out there in California and understand how to deploy that if it should happen here. I think the issue at the end of the day will be, what is the defense against federal overreach in this area?
Hmm.
Yeah, we're looking at the courts, and it's federal courts. And there's been a lot of jockeying since the first administration to place, judges on the bench who, effectuate this administration's policy. So I think we have to sort of wait and see. But certainly, I think there are a lot of very strong legal defenses. There is a tradition with respect to states' rights that are being just turned on their heads by this administration.